Okay. Okay, so we've agreed, in the interest of absolutely maximizing our time this evening, we agreed to keep introductions to a brief, but just to flag for you. Sonia Corrêa, on my right, on my extreme right, but you know what I mean when I say extreme right, right? Well,
sorry
okay.
for that. Sorry for that.
Yes, but
it was not my plan.
In the best and the best of ways. Sonia Corrêa has been involved in research and advocacy activities related to gender equality, health and sexuality since the late 1970s. Between 1992 and 2009, she coordinated the Sexual and Reproductive Health and Rights Research Program at Dawn, which is a development alternatives with Women for a New Era, a global South feminist network. Since 2002, she has been a research associate at the Brazilian Interdisciplinary Association for AIDS, where with Richard Parker, she co-chairs the Sexuality Policy Watch program, a global forum comprising researchers and activists engaged in the analyses of global trends in sexuality politics.
Somebody mentioned that our guests, Judith and Françoise, can't hear us. Is that right? Well, they can't. Can you hear us now? No. But you can, Judith, but not. You can hear, and you can as well, Françoise. I think Françoise can't hear us. You can you hear me now? Is it just that I'm not speaking? Ah. Yes, I do. Okay, that's great. Fantastic. You should hear your own introductions. Judith Butler is Distinguished Professor in the Graduate School and former Maxine Elliott Professor in the Department of Comparative Literature and the Program of Critical Theory at the University of California at Berkeley. Their books include Gender Trouble, Feminism and the Subversion of Identity, Bodies That Matter on the Discursive Limits of Sex, The Psychic Life of Power, Theories of Subjection. In 2023, they'll publish a book on the anti-gender ideology movement. Françoise Vergès is a Réunionist theorist, independent curator and anti-racist decolonial scholar and feminist activist. She has written on Frantz Fanon, Aimé Césaire, colonial slavery, colonial psychiatry, anti-colonialism, decolonial feminism, and the impossible decolonization of the museum. In 2015, she co-founded with 5 other women the non-profit Decolonize the Arts and the University Decolonizing the Arts that ran until 2021. She has written on Marie Seconde and Aimé Césaire, with whom she published Resolutely Black. Vergès works with artists and curates workshops and performances with artists and activists of colour. Recent publications include The Wombs of Women, Race, Capital, Feminism, A Feminist Theory of Violence, A Decolonial Feminism, De la Violence Coloniale de l'Espace Public. All of those in the last 2 years.
Okay, so the order of the evening then is as follows. Each of the speakers, Sonia, Judith and Françoise, in that order, will speak to and reflect on the context of anti-gender that they are working within and also the kinds of modes of resistance that are taking place in that context. Once they have all spoken their 15-minute interventions, we will invite them to reflect on how we might think transnationally across these contexts and modes of resistance and what we might learn from them. And after which, we will open the floor to Q&A. Can I now invite Sonia to kick off the conversation with her 15-minute intervention, please? Thank you, Sonia.
Good night. Can you hear me? The sound is okay? Well, I want to begin by thanking Julie, the Transnational Anti-Gender Narrative and Resistance Project, and in particular, my dear friends from the Gender Department. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be part of this trialogue, especially because my journey into the dire world of anti-gender politics, which brings me here today, begins exactly here, 6 years ago, when I spent a few months as a visiting researcher at the Gender Department. This was the first time I met Judith personally, But also, this is when I had the opportunity to exchange views with European researchers that were doing research on anti-gender politics already at that point. And this has opened my eyes to grasp that what I has been working and seeing in terms of gender battles in Latin America and globally since the 90s were not business as usual. It was something entirely new. What I will share with you are a few insights that have emerged from these explores, but also from having lived the last 4 years, under the anti-gender and neo-fascist shadows of the Bolsonaro government in Brazil that fortunately was defeated exactly a month ago. A very small margin of votes, I should say. 2 million votes for our country is not much, but very inspiringly, these were the votes of the poor people earning less than 2 wages a month, 60% of women, 60% of black people, the great majority of LGBTQI persons, and I would say the almost full majority of indigenous people. So that's a good beginning. It's going to be hard, but we have started well, I would say. So I want to say also that the ideas that I bring here are not just mine. They are not individual skill, basically, just exclusively. It's also the result of many exchanges with other people, and particularly the work of the amazing researchers that have done case studies in Latin America that I'm not going to list for the sake of time because the list is too long. The first aspect that I want to underline is about context. And for those who were in the workshop today, I will start by where Alia has finished the workshop. To say that anti-gender politics has swept across Latin America in the course of the last 10 years because it has found a fertile ground to thrive, which has been created by long-course intersecting systemic trends. The ongoing politicization of the religious in dogmatic manifestations, the democratizing and egalitarian effects, but also extractivist economists of neoliberalism that has swept over the region as well, and not less importantly, in our case, the distortions of the redemocratization processes that have started in the 90s, many of which are rooted in colonial legacies of racist, patriarchy or patriarchalism, heterosexism, chronism, and most principally structural violence. However, even if context matters a lot, Latin American current gender wars must also be read, as we have been saying all the day long today, through the lenses of intense transnational exchange in which they are plugged. This intensity is certainly partially explained by the digitalization of life and politics of the last 20 years, but its genealogy is much older. In my view, today's anti-gender politics in the Americas, and I'm including the US here, and Europe, should be read as a late manifestation of the slow but steady reconfiguration of ultra-conservatism and ultra-right politics, which began in the 1970s. A number of anti-gender tricontinental transnational connections at play today can be traced back to those early times, and I'm just going to give you one thread. In 1960, Paul Weyrich, who was the founder of the US Heritage Foundation, a main think tank of the right, befriended the Brazilian founder of the ultra-Catholic Tradition, Family and Property, TFP, whose later European branch mothered Ordo Iuris in Poland in 2013. and the ex-National Secretary of Family of the Bolsonaro government has close links with Ordo Iuris. Closer to us, and not accidentally, the gradual intellectual outlining of the gender ideology phantasm, which began after the Vatican Gender Trouble of 1995, right before the Beijing Conference, counted with a substantial contribution of several Latin American authors and translators, and Leticia Sabsai has mentioned the Peruvian bishops, but there are many names in that list. The other legacy of that is that anti-gender politics today in Latin America is settled upon an old infrastructure of anti-abortion positions and networks that was there since the 80s, and it's also Catholic, originally Catholic, now it's mixed up. And the strongest evidence of this transnationality is that around 2012-2013, anti-gender politics erupted concomitantly in Europe and in Latin America, intriguingly enough not in the US. On the side of the Atlantic, this was the time of the Manif pour tout in France, the same-sex marriage attack in Croatia, but also when quite significantly, three icon institutions of anti-gender ideology were created. Citizen Go and Vox in Spain, but also Ordo Iuris in Poland. On my side of the ocean, fierce wars against gender in education began in Brazil and Paraguay at the same time. The ex-president Rafael Correa deployed a deplorable anti-gender sermon, and sexuality-related battles arose at the Assembly of the Organization of the American State. A third insight to bring here is that on both sides of the oceans, this mobilization differed from previous ultra-conservative politics, which attacked feminism, abortion, sex education, LGBTQI rights, somehow in isolation and at random. Now, this attack directly gender or gender ideology. A phantasm, an open signifier of, if you want, a basket in which those various issues previously attacked one by one were now bundled together and mixed up with pedophilia, death of the family, and the very destruction of humanity, in quotes. Depending on contextual conditions, these items can be extracted selectively from the basket and be assorted. But even so, gender as a concept and a domain of knowledge production is the main target, and this is very important. Anti-gender politics go beyond legal battles or influencing politics through insidious means, which was the way the Catholic Church operated in Latin America. To use their own terminology, is meta-political. It manifests as bottom-up politics. This is the people against gender. At the core of the complex assemblage that fueled these mobilizations, there is always a core composed by religious forces around which a plethora of secular actors orbit. In Latin America, this includes the military in many countries, like Brazil, but also open fascist groups, like in Europe. As noted by the Uruguayan researcher Paulo Raveca, anti-gender politics is highly intersectional. It is a varying example of what the Argentinian thinker Paulo Stefanoni has named La derecha callejera, or the street protest right wing. More recently, as we know, essentialist or trans-exclusionary feminist, whose genealogy is different, has entered the same ecology. Most significantly, in Latin America, anti-gender mobilization has rapidly become the fuel of right-wing cyclones, that ambition to take over the state. Deployed to incite sexual panic in the mid-2000s, 10 years later, gender ideology was firmly associated with Marxism or communism, which tells a lot about the anti-egalitarian passion of anti-gender forces. And it was as such that it fueled a series of perfect electoral storms. The 2016 Colombian peace agreement that was defeated because of attacks on gender, the 2018 presidential election in Costa Rica, and the Brazilian 2018 election that took Bolsonaro to power. The same happened in Uruguay in 2019, and this is a case that is not so debated, and I think this is unfortunate. In terms of negative impacts, I dare saying that the area most affected is basic and secondary education. Gender and sexuality curricula are systematic targets by campaigns, litigation, executive decrees, school invasions in Argentina. Gender studies have also been stricken, as regrettably announced by the grotesque attack against Judith Butler in 2017 in Brazil, which was a sort of pilot ground for the 2018 anti-gender cyclone of the election, but with not the same scale and intention. And then more recently, I would say that the dehumanization of trans persons has taken the center of the stage. In this new scenario, anti-gender, anti-trans feminists are somehow the main protagonists of the new wars. There is transphobic aggressiveness in social media, attacks on gender identity in childhood and in sports, but also anti-gender feminist positions are rapidly penetrating academic, but also human rights circles, including in, let's say, the inter-American system. I want to say, and maybe this can be a topic for discussion in the debate because I have very few minutes, one topic that we have not discussed enough in the studies was how anti-gender politics connects with racism. This is a very important topic. I would say there are many connections. For example, in the case of Brazil, anti-gender evangelical forces perpetrate continuous violations of religious racism against Afro-Brazilian spiritual tradition and indigenous people. But the overlapping is not so straightforward as in Europe. On the other hand, the main impact of anti-gender politics in Latin America is, in my view, the effect on the political order itself, and how anti-gender actors became rapidly, openly connected with ultra-right forces. This happened during the COVID pandemic, when anti-gender forces became vaccine and COVID denialists, consequently contributing for the vast death toll left behind in the region, particularly in my own country, Brazil, but also in Peru. The dehumanizing biopolitics of anti-gender openly interwove with ultra-right politics. And from whatever angle we look at, the Bolsonaro regime was by far the worst case in point. After 2019, while the phantasmatic evils of gender ideology were transported to the state grammar, public policies in health, education, human rights, public security, and the environment were systematically destroyed. This devastation is now daily disclosed by the presidential transition team, lively portraying what Judith inside a few weeks ago, that the supposed destructiveness of gender ideology fundamentally serves to conceal the real destruction deployed by neo-fascists. And I will end here saying that despite this devastation, we have had some experiences of resistance in the region, and I think it's important to at least list them briefly. The first, I would say, is daily life resistance. It's the silent and invisible resistance of people, particularly trans persons, feminists, in all this context. as we have lived in Brazil, is the experience of waking up each morning and being prepared for the worst to happen. I want to insist on that. But there are political stories to tell, just like the example of the well-known and highly successful struggle for abortion in Argentina, which could not have achieved its result if it was not for the intersectional coalition that built it up, that ranged from trans and indigenous communities to the center of the political spectrum. A last but not so known story is the experience of the Brazilian platform of teachers against conservatism in education. This is a marvelous experience that needs to be researched and made more visible. At the transnational level, one remarkable initiative is the LGBTI coalition of the Organization of the American States that began organizing in 2008, 2009, and was there ready to respond when the anti-gender attack began in 2013. Then in 2019, when the assembly was held in Colombia, a WhatsApp intersectional group was created to facilitate the engagement with this process. It exists until today. It counts with more than 200 people. The participants are feminists, researchers, queer people, lots of trans people, Black communities, I think some indigenous communities. And it became an incredible platform of sharing and debating critical issues, as, for example, now, the detrimental impacts of anti-gender feminism. And to end, I think that we should also value the growing presence of feminist, Black, indigenous, progressive lesbians, gays, and particularly trans voices in bodies in electoral politics. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sonia. Such a rich introduction to the context that the history of anti-gender movements comes out of. I loved the kind of pithy phrase, the people against gender, as the kind of framing through which this takes place, and I'm sure we'll come back to that question in the discussion. And thank you also for raising the immensely important issue of resistance, without which we would be lost. So thank you so much. And I'm going to call on Judith Butler now. Not quite yet. There you are. We can see you, but you're quite faint.
Am I plugged in? And
that's better.
audible?
Yes.
Okay.
Hello.
Hello. Well, I'm glad to be here virtually, and I'm sorry that I can't be here in any other way. Can't be there. But I want just to applaud this network and to say how enormously important it is and how pleased I am to be part of it. You know, if the problem we're facing in this conference is simply how to defend an academic field of study against other academic criticisms, well, things would be easier. But I think what we're encountering in the anti-gender ideology movement is not only an opposition to what is called gender, but a refusal to consider what gender actually means, what gender studies does, what theories that make use of gender actually say. The opposition is, of course, focused on gender, but it's also, I would say, an attack on reading, to open and critical debate, and what we might still say is the task of the university and the public culture of democracy. Now that may sound idealistic, especially to an audience in the UK where the university is captured by neoliberal forms of destruction, and public discourse has become saturated by brief acts of discursive terror on media platforms that profit from every hit or bite. But let's hold on to the possible yearnings for a world free of that destruction for the moment. Since the attacks on gender, as if it were a pernicious or falsifying ideology, are also attacks on democracy, and they fuel authoritarianism and in some cases fascism. I'm imagining that today you heard about several genealogies of the anti-gender ideology movement. The Vatican's discourse on gender, as you probably know, intensifies its phantasmatic power within contemporary politics. As a fearsome and destructive phantasm, gender is difficult to discuss. It must be dispelled like a demon, or destroyed like a plague, or criminalized like a child molester. How does one argue with opponents under such conditions? The answer is doubtless to study the phantasmatic nature of the term as it has been constructed and circulated in order to ask, what are we really talking about when we talk about gender today? If we act as if gender is the only problem because gender is named, then we fail to take into account all the social anxieties and fears and the collective hatreds that have gathered at the site of gender. But if we say that the debate about gender is really something else, then we fail to account for why all those anxieties collect in the way they do, organized by their specific logic at gender and not some other place. Although the movement against gender has many religious dimensions, it is not always a religious movement. And as you know, Catholic institutions and parishes around the world have affirmed gay and lesbian lives, trans rights, and the variability of gender in our world. And for some Christians and other religious adherents, natural law and divine will are the same. God made the sexes in a binary way, and it's simply not the prerogative of humans to remake them in any other way. Now, some feminist scholars of religion dispute this, suggesting that the Bible has some interesting and conflicting views on this very topic. We could say that this older science, which some date to the 13th century, maintains that sex differences are established in natural law, in the sense that the content of that law is established by nature, and that therefore presumably has validity everywhere. That law is not supposed to change by virtue of any positive law, but positive existing law, the law established by humans, should be grounded in natural law and not defy its precepts. Since nature, it's argued, is established by God, to defy natural law is to defy the will of God. What follows from this set of beliefs is that if one has a will or acts willfully, in the Sarah Ahmed sense, then not only does one defy God, but one has presumably taken over his will. Pope Benedict made public his concern at the Beijing Conference on the Status of Women in 1995, then again in 2004 as head of the Pontifical Council on the Family in a famous letter to bishops underscoring the potential of gender to destroy feminine values important to the Church and the natural distinction between the two sexes. He then went further in 2012, maintaining that such ideologies deny the preordained duality of man and woman, and thus deny the family as a reality established by creation. Because, he argued, man and woman are created by God, those who seek to create themselves deny the creative power of God and even steal that creative power. By 2016, Pope Francis, despite his occasionally progressive views, continued the line developed by Benedict, but sounded an even stronger alarm. And here I quote, "We are experiencing a moment of the annihilation of man as the image of God." He specifically included as an instance of this defacement the ideology of gender. He was clearly outraged that, and I quote, "Today children are taught in school that everyone can choose his or her sex, and this, terrible." Then he made affirmative reference to Benedict and claimed God created man and woman, God created the world in a certain way, and we are doing the exact opposite. That was in San Martin in 2017. From his perspective, humans have taken over the creative power of the divine. And he's argued that proponents of gender are like those who support or deploy nuclear arms. And what is their target? Well, their target is creation itself. And this suggests that whatever gender is, it carries enormous destructive power in the minds of those who oppose it. Indeed, an unfathomable and terrifying destructiveness. It represents as a demonic force of destruction. It is represented, rather, as a demonic force of destruction pitted against God's creative powers. So obviously, according to this view, only the divine has creative powers. The divine created male and female. If anyone departs from assigned sex, believing they can establish a different sex assignment, they're stealing and destroying the creative powers that belong solely to God. But this devil, this diabolical ideology that gender is, works demonically. That is to say, it entices, it influences, it inculcates and grooms, it exploits the youth and others who are susceptible to believing in these new powers of self-determination provided by something called gender. It doesn't matter if a trans person claims that actually I'm not choosing this gender is my given reality, it's internal to me, and some would even say it's my God-given reality. They are nevertheless claiming a gender for themselves that was not the one originally assigned at birth. So there's an assumption that sex assignment is a continuation of God's creative power, which means God apparently needs some medical authorities or legal authorities to do his job. In any case, I just want to call attention to the fact that gender is very seriously considered a devil, or the devil himself, which is one reason they cannot read us, because to read a book on gender and to argue about it on its terms or ask what its terms mean is a form of contamination. Indeed, one woman I met in Switzerland said she was praying for me, and I said, why? And she said, because you deny God's truth. And I said, it's okay, I'm all right. And she said, I said, did you ever read anything I ever wrote? She said, no, I would never read such a book. It's like, oh, okay. And end of conversation. But, you know, it's a good joke, but it's also very serious in the sense that certain ideas, and here I think so-called gender ideology and critical race theory, which has also become a phantasm. Nobody sits down and reads the original text of critical race theory to see what this legal school was all about. Nobody situates critical race theory in the history of black studies or black theory or black philosophy or black law. In any case, I want to suggest that if gender is, at least for the two popes, the last two popes, the contemporary workings of the devil, or the equivalent of a nuclear bomb, then those who stand for God, the good, the earth, the people, will surely rise up against gender, or so the propaganda now goes in many parts of the world. In short, I would say, because we cannot argue with people who do not read us, or who refuse to read us, or seek to ban our books, we actually have to operate to produce a counter-imaginary, to expose and to deflate their phantasmatic production. And how we do that, I think, is a question of how arts and politics comes together. So I just want to mention that as my overall wish.
Just another couple of minutes. Just another 2 minutes. Sorry.
Okay. I do have a history of how the anti-gender ideology emerged into the U.S., and I think that has happened in part through the evangelical churches and the World Congress of Families, and interestingly enough, the effort to put anti-gender ideology at the front of its agenda was concocted by some Americans some U.S. citizens who went to visit some Russian sociologists who faulted the right to abortion and pro-LGBT legislation for bringing about a fall in Russian birth rates, and they feared civilizational collapse. And that happened actually in 1995. So this particular collaboration goes back a long time. I understand that I don't have a lot of time. I do want to say that authoritarian and neo-fascist movements, and I include the anti-gender ideology movement among them, rely on the fear of destruction that many people now feel as a matter of daily life. And the reason why they fear this may well have to do with the neoliberal devastation of work life, that increase in precarity of work, the pandemic, systemic racism, sexual violence, femicide. There are so many reasons to fear destruction or to not know how to explain the kind of destruction we are experiencing with climate change. And one of the things that happens with this phantasmatic figure is that all the fear of destruction and the source of destruction that we seek to find or to understand is located in this phantasm of gender, or sometimes also in critical race theory, that these are the forces that are destroying our lives, which of course allows neoliberalism, climate change, systemic racism, and femicide to continue without any interruption. I will say that we would be foolish to think that this movement is not highly transnational. Putin and Maloney very often say the exact same things within days of one another. Just 2 months ago, they both warned that the European Union's policies against discrimination on the basis of gender will result in a situation in which you cannot use the terms mother or father, but will be forced to say parent one and parent two. They both said the exact same thing. The fantasy, this is my final point, the fantasy articulated in that utterance is that gender is a policing function, if not a new form of totalitarianism. The state will be forced to strip you of your status as a mother and a father, but also it will take away your sex identity, according to Maloney. But of course, what they are doing, I mean, they are saying you will no longer be able to call yourself male or female because of the rise of the cultural police that they call gender. But who are the people who are being told you cannot call yourself male or female? You cannot assume legal parental rights. You cannot enter into marriage. In fact, all of those basic rights, including sex identity, parenting, gender, are being stripped from those who are most vulnerable, because those who are stripping them are afraid of being stripped themselves. We can talk about that logic. Another point I'd like to talk about is the accusation that gender is either colonial or imperial. Maybe we can open that up in the general conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's awful to have to interrupt anybody, isn't it? Because it's so wonderful to hear both of you so far talking, but we want to make sure that we also hear from you. There's you can't see, but there's over 200 people in this freezing cold room, absolutely rapt by everything that's being said. Thank you so much for mapping out that question of terror and yearning, that doubled issue we're dealing with here, and we'll come back, I think, to that question that you've raised of imperialism and colonialism in the discussion. So I'm going to invite Françoise Vergès now to come into the conversation. Hello, Françoise.
Hello.
Hello, welcome.
Hello.
Very early morning.
Very early for you, right? Very early in the morning.
Yes, very early in the morning, and also I'm sorry for my voice because I got a cold, so I'm not very feeling very well. But do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you for inviting me. I wish I were there, but I'm talking to you from the other side of the world for this very important event. So, I will be talking about Europe, not so because I think it's very, most important place now, but because I live there and I rather, talk about the place where I'm living. And so, I would want to say, raise some point and then offer something about resistance. First, in Europe, we have seen, the rise of far-right parties in power, represented even by women, like in Italy with Giorgia Meloni, or in France by Marine Le Pen, but also in Hungary, in Poland, in Sweden, in Spain, in Denmark, the return of far-right party in the parliament and their possibility, their capacity to influence about laws. And they are told their speeches about protecting families and how these values of protecting family goes along for them with anti-refugees politic and Islamophobia and anti-blackness. And the second point, this was also brought by a counter-revolution which has been prepared for years in Europe. There was the idea, that in the United States or elsewhere, there had been a preparation for this counter-revolution, and the idea that in Europe has been more open and more liberal. But in fact, this has been already prepared for years. In the 1970s, 1980s already, you had this anti-colonialism ideology that emerged, saying that the struggle for independence was worthless, that came from a far right conservative and philosopher, but what called the new philosopher in France. That this struggle was for nothing, because look at what happened. Women were sent back to the kitchen, and everything was under authoritarian regime. Especially the Algerian struggle was attacked. It was very important, especially in France. Also, a movement in the more recent years of media bought by billionaires around Europe, not just in France, but around Europe, with libertarian politics and influencing absolutely the debate on anti-gender. As I say also, the general context in Europe with the anti-refugee politic, which is becoming more and more brutal and more cruel, and is being absolutely, as you do, rationalized, because we saw during the war in Ukraine, who was accepted as refugee and welcome, and that was right, of course, absolutely for Ukrainian refugee, but all the black and white refugee were not welcome at all. The war in Europe, bringing back war in Europe, was also discourse about that there was always peace in Europe, but because of course European states were externalizing the war elsewhere, in Cameroon or in Vietnam or elsewhere. So this war in Europe, which is a very important transformation today. Also we saw, the rise of Islamophobia absolutely becoming defining. To be European, you have to be Islamophobia. Islamophobia is part of the European identity. Anti-blackness, anti-Semitism, and the anti-abortion, anti-trans, anti-gay. How authoritarian capitalism and patriarchy have found a common ground with the violation of right. And that goes also with the criminalization of solidarity that we have seen in France, in Poland, or in Italy. Anyone helping a woman who wants abortion, or gay, or trans kids, or a refugee, all of them are being criminalized, even sent to jail, and with huge fine. There has been also in the recent years, in the recent decades, a new division of West and East and North and South in Europe. Along that has been a long division, but reactivated now. With the East, Europe, what was called Eastern Europe, Poland, Hungary, being for family, for values, again, the West, which is indicated echoes of the Putin discourse. But really, that division at the same time has been fed by the West, the Western Europe, the France, the Germany alliance, and for a while, with UK. And with a former colonial relation to the East, to Eastern Europe, they don't understand democracy and they don't understand rights. And we have to teach them some kind of civilizing issue, sending even NGO in Serbia, to teach them democracy and women's rights. That division between liberal West and illiberal East has been also working around that to mask, in fact, anti-gender politics that were shared perhaps on both sides. So, and in fact, the European community, when, for instance, Giorgia Meloni was elected in Italy, what was the main concern for the European community was what was the position about Ukraine. So the anti-refugee politics that she had, and the anti-woman, anti-feminism, and anti-trans, anti-gay, anti-gender politics were second to the fact that she had to express that she would follow European politics in supporting Ukraine. So a form of, real politics that goes against also, gender politics. We have, of course, the anti-gender politics throughout Europe are uneven. They are not exactly they are not the same in Hungary than in France or in Spain, but they are echoes, especially, as I say, with the fact that you have a party within the parliament, within all this parliament, pushing, and the media also owned by billionaires with libertarian politics. We see also, so this is uneven, but nonetheless with the echo. Also the racism, that is really also, and as I say, anti-Semitism. This is not the same thing in the anti-gender politics. If you're a white woman or if you're a black, brown, indigenous woman in the law, it's absolutely not the same. Anti-gender politics in Italy will not be the same for white Italian women or for black and brown women, especially Muslim and black women. There is also in Europe an increase of poverty everywhere because of neoliberal capitalism and its new form. And women are the first being attacked. So you have a general atmosphere of exhaustion, of stress and mental suffering. It's brought also by COVID. We know that COVID, excuse me, that around in Europe but also around the world, women were the first to be affected by COVID consequences within their jobs, because most women work in what we call hospitality services and so on and so forth, and they were the first to be laid off. It also could be brought by more violence, more femicide, more violence, sexual violence against women. And the government in Europe did not do a thing about that. The fact that the rate of mortality was higher among black and white community was put to the push aside, and that, all of this. But there is, when we talk about anti-gender politics, if we talk about Europe, many different levels that we have to think together. This rise of far-right party, they are being elected and having now a voice in the parliament, a voice at the European community. Many of them, dozens of them, are elected in the European Parliament, and they can effectively affect, some laws that are not necessarily on the front page, but we are, slightly impact that, and which will affect life, for gender, anti-gender politics in Europe. You have the war, the return of the war in Europe, that also has, an important effect on the question of politics and on the question of anti-gender things. And again, as I say, racism. Racism is absolutely affecting gender politics. It's absolutely, not the same for white and black and brown women. And white feminism in Europe has mostly, the mainstream, the one that we hear in the media, or that we hear at the European community, at the European Parliament, or in the European Parliament, is not talking about this race question, is not bringing it. So when they are fighting for, against anti-gender politics, they are talking for some kind of universalist form of anti-gender politics, and asking for more rights. For instance, in France, the fight for more rights does not pay attention to the fact that black and brown and indigenous women, because you do have indigenous women in France, are not being talked about, are not being included in their analysis of the anti-gender politics. is also one of the things that we have to think about when we think about Europe is imperialism, European imperialism. The intervention level, French or British or other state are doing, for example, especially many in Africa right now, and how this has a return effect on the politics in Europe, how this has anti-gender politics, because when armies in Africa rape women, dispossess, kill, there is an impact. There is a cause of return effect in the society of Europe. A certain, habits of cruelty and brutality that come and that came into an anti-gender politics become also rationalized, and how this being played in Europe. What has been so greater inequality, more violence, more cruelty, and less, alliance among, feminist movement. Again, in France, the very important movement against sexual violence, incredible mobilizing, with a lot of young women joining that movement, with incredible energy and determination, incredible mobilization, does not really tackle the race question and the class question in that question. It asks, for instance, for more punishment, more carceral, politics, and not paying attention to the fact that France is still a colonial state, has still colonial territory around the world. And if we pay attention to that, then the space itself, how we think about the temporalities and the spatialities of resistance, has to be taken. They cannot be national, as effectively this workshop is absolutely underlining. And this question of transnationalism has to be brought squarely at the center of resistance. Absolutely has to be really one of the foundation of the movement. What kind of feminist internationalism can be built that really pay respect to what's happened before and to what is today, and pay attention to what has been the resistance by Black and indigenous women within Europe, challenging Europe. What is Europe? What is the idea of Europe? And what is the idea of Europe that we want to fight for? What is this Europe we are talking about, which has been built on colonialism and imperialism, extraction and dispossession? As I say, studies have shown that women will be the most affected by the COVID economic consequence and the political consequences. What has been the response of the left, European left, if we think that there's still something of that kind? Very little about in this question. Because the huge process of decolonization in the left, the very important process of decolonization of the European left by itself, for itself, has barely started. The left has to really rethink what has been its complicity with race politics and colonial and imperialist politics to this day. They have to see, even in the environmental movement, they have to see not just within Europe, how Europe can change, but how Europe, has been being able to reach this wealth out of extraction and dispossession of people in Africa, mostly in Africa, but also in Asia and in the Caribbean. So the transnational feminism, if it's not really also looking at the connection, temporal and spatial, that are connecting also the past and the present and the future, that is, to resist this anti-gender politics. And I, what Judith was saying was extremely important. How do we resist?
Just 2 more minutes, Françoise.
2 minutes. The form of resistance I've been, talking about are the strike by women. The more and more strike by women in Europe, more than working. So you have the cleaners, the march and the protest. The fact that effectively new network, underground network, are being set up, to help women who have been raped during the war for, to have abortion and to have also contraception. But again, there are less for refugee women than for Ukrainian women. And also a lot of rewriting now happening of the history of struggle and looking at the long struggle and the long history of struggle of anti-gender politics and how the resistance against this anti-gender politics can be revived and how can we learn from them to effectively confront the new, what is at stake today and that are brought by neoliberal capitalism, authoritarian regime, and climate disaster. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Françoise. Just the connections between the brutality and the cruelty and the need for a transnational response is absolutely central to any effective movement that might counter these, you described it, the absolute brutality, and Judith described it as terror. And so it was wonderful to hear you underline that. Thank you. We're going to turn now to asking each of our speakers and each of our conversationalists to pick up on something that one of the others said, or to raise a transnational issue, something that might make you think about a different or a particular kind of politics of resistance. We've only then got 5 minutes for each of you, I'm afraid, and then so you can't really do a lot in that time, but maybe pick up on the piece that gets you going the most. We'll just do that in the same order.
Okay.
Sonia.
Well, I think that one first thing that all the day today, all the discussions today, but also this dialogue we are having here, is that in thinking about resistance and responses, one main challenge remains to keep researching and trying to understand what is going on. Because, for example, what I brought here was a sort of ideal type of anti-gender feminists or anti-gender struggles or anti-gender wars that are at play in Europe and Latin America, but this is a sort of an ideal type that does not transport exactly to everywhere. So I think one challenge is to keep researching to understand how this gender phantasm manifests with same elements connected with ultra-neoliberalism, with authoritarianism, with nationalism, militarization, racism, dispossession, but how this plays out in each context. We need to know that better to be able to design better responses, because responses from one place do not apply to everywhere. So I think that the recognition of that heterogeneity and mapping that heterogeneity is absolutely vital, even when, if that template works between Latin America and Europe quite well, it does not play, not even for the US. That was a sort of exporter of anti-gender ideology, but in the US it does not manifest that same way. My second observation is that I said that a long time back, and I think it's time to say again, we have to understand that anti-gender politics is micro-politics because it plays at the very ground level, at the school level, at the family level. It is macro-politics in the sense that is connected with forces that want to grab the state, and it's geopolitics. And to frame it like that, I think it's a useful way of doing that. And thirdly, as I said, anti-gender forces and ultra-right forces and neo-fascist formations, they are highly intersectional. And our responses have to be intersectional. Intersectional in a very consistent way. And we have a problem here because we talk a lot about intersectionality, but we are not so good in transporting it to consistent intersectional politics. And I think this is a topic to be debated because it becomes yet more important when the response cannot be just the response from the gender and sexuality and human rights, whatever it is, field. I know from the Brazilian experience, it's not possible. It would not have been possible to evict Bolsonaro if it was not the presence of many other forces with whom it's still more complicated to do intersectional politics. I'm talking about progressive religious forces, I'm talking about political parties, I'm talking about public intellectuals, the media itself. So that is a challenge for us to keep having conversations about, because without that, at least from our experience in Brazil, we would be under a full new fascist regime if it was not for that very broad and very tense and very complicated, fragile coalition that was able to evict Bolsonaro a month ago. And we have to deal with that now, with all the complications that this implies, huge complications. It's not an easy task.
Thank you so much. Judith.
Yes. I guess I want to just underscore how important it is to link the resistance to anti-gender ideology with a critique of colonialism, precisely because the Vatican, Orban, a wide range of people have figured gender as a colonial force, or Orban calls it cultural imperialism imposed by the EU, and we've heard that argument from Putin as well. And their argument, of course, is that if you get rid of gender, you're going to reverse the colonizational imperialism that it represents, and you can return to hyper-nationalist or church-based communities. And I think it's important to remember Maria Lugones's arguments based on Anibal Cristal, the concept of decoloniality there, because that argument is that colonization actually imposed impressive gender norms on the global south and intensified the subordination of women, as well as the pathologization of non-gender conforming queer intersex people who had previously had forms of belonging in their communities. So it's one thing to say that gender is a sign and vessel of colonization doing its dirty work. And look, there's some forms of white feminism that are, imperialistic, that are in the service of colonialism. But to say that gender is the force of colonization right now is to say that the marginal and struggling folks are actually representing colonial powers, and that's a pernicious form of reversal, since they are the ones who are indeed suffering from colonizing power. And I think that colonial power orders gender in patriarchal and heteronormative ways, and I think that Françoise's work brings that together. We can never separate those two things in her work. So the resistance to colonization, which should be part of any resistance to the anti-gender ideology movement, should be linked with the affirmation of queer, trans, intersex lives. Indeed, decolonial and post-colonial queer and feminist positions do that, and I think that nothing could be more important than to remember that ideals of dimorphism and heteronormativity are not just imposed throughout Latin America, but also in Africa, in various parts of Africa, and there are now, of course, African scholars who are doing excellent work on trying to take that apart. So if we're to have an effective response, we must have a decolonial, feminist, queer perspective on these matters.
Thank you so much. Françoise.
I do think also that a very rigorous analysis of the difference, but at the same time the commonality is extremely important, without insisting also too much on this is specific, but what connect all this. I think it's very, very absolutely important today, absolutely essential. And I also agree with Judith about not conform. We should not confuse anti-colonialism with a form of anti-Western thing that we see in India or in Brazil or in Russia today. The manipulation, the instrumentalization, for instance, even the capture of some form of anti-colonial vocabulary by authoritarian regime, pushing for some kind of civilizing, return of, whatever, some kind of fantastic pre-colonial thing. It's very important to absolutely clarify what is anti-imperialism today and not falling into the kind of cancer. We have a lot of work to do, We should not also too idealize the fact that in pre-colonial time everything was nice, for everyone. It's very, we have really to work. I mean, there is something, because even in pre-colonial time it was like that, a lot of things have changed since then. So we have to look really, and not falling into cultural, too much like culturalist argument, but really political in our answer. So really a rigorous analysis of how structural adjustment are affected all over the world, how advantage of the politics are connected with also some term of authoritarian religion, as Judith was saying, and look at what's happening in Iran, for instance, for me, what the Iranian women are doing is decolonial feminism in this way. And we have to listen to what is happening. This is, for instance, a lot of work to do. So this, I think, this kind of gathering are absolutely essential today.
Okay, thank you so much. We certainly have a lot of work to do. I mean, I was just listening to the three of you has been, mind-blowing in some senses, because it just sort of itemized the kinds of things that we have to keep in mind, but also be super careful in terms of developing ethical, careful, political, and intellectual strategies for intervening in this contemporary moment of crisis. So some of the things that, just before I open the floor to questions, some of the things that you three of you brought together was sort of the importance of holding together, the focus on the transnational, while sort of not losing sight of the politics of specificity. So the historical and political specificity, but also the effect on particular peoples in particular locations. And also what Françoise, you were saying, also at the same time not losing sight of the connections, right across these various transnational sites. What we've certainly done this evening is sound a firm kind of, sound a death knell to methodological nationalism. That will not do. And that is something that we've been talking about throughout the day as well. Françoise, you were talking about Europe, what is the idea of Europe? And I'm thinking about Aimé Césaire, Europe is indefensible, right? Aimé Césaire writing that in the Discourse of Colonialism. And so, but at the same time, so very important to think that, to think about the transnational, but the transnational can sort of needs to be anti-colonial, anti-racist, and so on, and at the same time the transnational must sort of be decolonial, is not the same as, or the anti-colonial, the critique that Judith was talking about is not anti-Western, right? So we have to be absolutely clear that the anti-colonial is not anti-Western in the mode that authoritarian right-wing regimes mobilize. And also, very importantly, we've been reminded this throughout the day, but all three of you brought that up, keeping our eyes absolutely peeled on the specific materialities of neoliberal authoritarian capitalism, right, which provides the kind of the material site for the flourishing and the destruction of everyday life and the reproduction of neoliberal precarity, which provides the absolute sort of bedrock for some of this, for most of this sort of anti-gender movement. And of course, while the critique of anti-gender movements, we have to do the work of research and mapping and so on, but that this work must be decolonial, this work must be anti-colonial, post-colonial, and linked to feminist positions. So thank you very much for all of that, a wonderful sort of bringing together of so many of these important and key things for us to do. So sort of, you know, for us to kind of work out on a path. That's been a question today as well. What should we be doing? How should we be doing this, right? So this has been absolutely fantastic. Okay, so I'm now going to open the floor to Q&A, and I'm looking at my watch. I'm looking at my watch, and I'm going to sort of, at the moment, let's just say we've got 20 minutes, okay? Just thereabout, I'm stretching it. But what we'll do is that you must wait for the mic to come to you. It would be very, very lovely if you could very briefly say your name when you ask the question. Remember, this is not an existential exercise by any means, so just really your name. And also, so not who you are, right, in that moment, in that kind of way, right? So, and also, if you could please keep your questions super brief, as we'd like to include as many questions as we possibly can, and what we'll do to maximize the number of questions, we'll collect a few in the first instance. So please just raise your hands if you would like to ask a question to our speakers, and do wait for the mic to come to you. Okay, so if I could have a sense of the hands, please, and then the mic will come to you. So I see a question right at the back. So there's the question one right at the back on the second floor. Second last row there. And I saw a question right here in the third row, just here. And then I saw a hand right there. Yes. So that's number 3. And then there's a question right there in the middle. So can I have 4 questions, please, and as briefly as you possibly can, so that we can get another round in. Thank you so much.
Hello, my name is Jolly Ghosh, and as we are talking about anti-gender politics, and I would like to talk briefly about India. So there is a very recent violence against women case where I won't talk about the sensitive. So I won't talk about the sensitive details of this case. It was like a young woman of 26-year-old was murdered and by her partner. So the main, narratives when the media talks about this case is about live-in relationship. The woman is Hindu and her partner was Muslim. So it is used in Indian context, in a very right-winged country. It is used to incite communal violence, and not talked about, violence against women. It's more about Islamophobia. Secondly, if we talk about some other case, for example, Hathras case, which is more about caste system, so we talk about the power dynamics there. So my question is, how do we conceptualize the narrative here? First of all, if we talk about the first case, which is inciting Islamophobia, because the woman is Hindu and the man is Muslim. In the second case, in a gang rape of a Dalit woman by upper caste men, where we are talking about the power dynamics. So my question is how we conceptualize the 2 different kind of narratives here.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Yes, please.
Hello, I'm Katie. Thank you all. My question was, after talking about the violence of the Catholic Church in promoting anti-gender movements and these statements of the popes, what is the role of, or what do you think the role of religion and faith is in fighting anti-gender movements?
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, please. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Eka Boli, and my question is, do you see a coherent rise of the women's plus LGBT vote bank across the global south that votes moderate rather than far right? And I do believe statistics from West Bengal does support the rise of a women's vote bank, not so much the LGBT. We don't have stats on that yet. So that's it.
Thank you. And yes, please.
Okay, so my name is Marta, and I wanted to ask, because I was listening to a conference a few days ago about Rita Segato and how she talks about Ciudad Juárez as a case in which you could see how the violence directed towards women was actually like a way of like meant to acquire domination, precisely because they didn't really kind of like have the power, or like they were in a situation of precarity in some way, and that made me think that maybe the destruction that we're seeing right now due to neoliberalism, it's actually also a reflection of like the how this supposed like liberal peace is breaking. And how like everything is being blamed on women as if like this was not a situation which was occurring before in other contexts. I don't know if I had properly faced it, but I wonder if like transnationalism can bring a light here in pointing out how there was never such a liberal peace in which like men were equal in some way, but it's actually there never was that liberal peace. There was always violence to acquire power, like by men, and that was inflicted even more by women, to women. Sorry. And on the other hand, I wondered whether like
can you just phrase it as a question, because we've only got
yes. So I mean like if in some way showing through transnational experiences that for example, some ways of like welfare here have been based on exploitation. If showing that could be a way of counter arguing against those who say that put like gender as the phantom of destruction in some way. So.
Okay, thank you. So there were 4 questions. I'm going to try my best to represent them.
Yeah.
Right.
So, because I could not very well.
I saw that. Yeah. I think that the first question was, how do we conceptualize the different narratives on violence against women that are mobilized, depending on different political contexts and political imperatives? The second was, I think, on what is the role of faith organizations in anti-gender politics and anti-gender mobilizations. The third was, is there a coherent rise of women and LGBTQI vote banks that vote moderately and then impact political sort of results, right? Results of political parties and so on. And the fourth was, I'm assuming that you were trying to ask, what is the usefulness of transnationalism as a methodological frame, right? In order to think about different patterns across. So that's my understanding of the 4 questions. So can I maybe ask Sonia to respond first, and then Judith, and then Françoise?
Yeah, I want to respond briefly to the question on religious, the place and role of religion within this battlefields and possibilities of resistance, because Latin America, I think, is a very interesting place to speak to that. First of all, because for a long time, even before anti-gender politics has emerged, from the US down to the Deep South, we had this surge of this amazing network, which is Catholic for free choice, or in Latin America, Catholics for the right to decide, which was an amazing voice to begin contrasting the views of the Catholic Church. And this has unfolded into a series of other voices from the religious sectors, including evangelicals, progressive evangelical voices. Like now in Brazil, we have evangelical feminists for gender and for abortion. And they have been extremely vocal, for example, during the last electoral campaign. And I think that when I was talking about the intersectional experience of the OAS Assembly, and also what unfolded in terms of this WhatsApp group with 200 people, lots of people inside that group are people from the progressive religious communities that are in conversation with feminists, with trans people, and are spreading our discourses and contestations, but at the same time bringing their views into our conversation, which I think is very important. I think to bring out the polyphonic voices of the religious communities in relation to these issues, but also in relation to democracy, to neoliberalism, their critique of neoliberalism is absolutely vital. Even if they are a minority by now, but they can impact communities, and we have seen that in the Brazilian experience. Also, for your question, I think there's one issue that we have not raised, which is important, is that anti-gender, anti-abortion forces or formations are full of women. Let's not forget that, okay? Bolsonaro political base in Brazil is inhabited by women, but also by the right-wing gays and even trans right-wing voices, okay? So that complexity also needs to be brought to the fore, and anti-gender feminists are just part of that problem. They came into the same ecology, but something else was playing out there. And I think there's a huge discomfort in the feminist, the imagined feminist community to address that. And I think it's absolutely critical that we name the problem and we start having conversations about that. And I think Judith is going to agree with me. There are many issues at play there, but one of them is the fact that, to a large extent, the category of woman remains as the main organizing principle of feminism, and this is limited and problematic. So we have to address that question, and I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. Judith, at that point, do you want to come in? Thank you.
May I just say one thing? I think we have to link, in many parts of the world, anti-gender ideology with anti-migrant politics, and many people have pointed this out, that, and we see it in Meloni and Orban and others, the return to nation, return to family, supports authoritarianism. It also rationalizes the devastation of social services that has been produced by vicious neoliberal economics, and that the reconstruction of patriarchal power through the family and the nation is part of what we're seeing in the expulsion of migrants, the refusal to save migrants at sea, the letting die, the containment, the indefinite detention. All of it is seeking to keep nation and family ordered by patriarchal principles. And we would be very foolish to allow a division like, oh, is this Islamophobia or is this anti-gender or anti-women? It's like, no, think them together, because they are operating together, which is not to say they are the same form of power, but they are interlinking, and it is our job to study that interlinkage, and also then to test it to see how it's working in different parts of the world. I think that's the one point I just want to make. I know time is short. And I agree, of course, faith organizations, a lot of LGBT rights have been won in the U.S. through progressive evangelical and progressive Catholic and progressive Jewish groups and progressive Muslim groups. So we need to reject secular arrogance. That will not produce the kind of solidarity we need.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with the fact that, the kind of secular fundamentalism will not absolutely not help. I know most of them from the South, like non-absolutism church being also on the side of anti-colonial movement, and today we will the strikes of some churches in Africa and Asia and also in Europe are very important. So that's one thing. So, anti-gender feminism, this has always been there. I mean, this is, it's very important to effectively understand why, that feminism is also a place for women on the right and on the far right. There is something, so, Melania is a woman, in Italy, and the Prime Minister of Serbia, she's a lesbian woman, very young, very, and neoliberal politics. So this is really, there is also perhaps some kind of expectation that this will still not nonetheless have, because we see a woman, we see a girl, we see a, so we still want this person to be, nonetheless, and then boom, and so we really had to drop that expectation. Otherwise, connecting with some kind of powerful representation, we have really also to